Welcome to Trash Compactor. I'm Josh, and today we ask, is Star Wars art or content? Can Star Wars have any integrity as art, as a Disney franchise money machine? Was it ever anything more than that under George Lucas? And can any film that's a product of the capitalist culture industry be true art or enjoyed as such? Joining me to discuss these thorny questions, he is a playwright, author of The Trade Federation, Let's Explore Globalization Through the Star Wars Prequels, who you can hear discuss that play on episode 19 of this podcast. His new play is Occupy Prescott, and it's available now from No Passport Press. Welcome back, Andy Boyd.
Good to be here, Josh.
Thanks for joining us again. And he is a playwright, author of the award-winning El Coqui, Espectacular, and the Bottle of Doom, which is about to mount its second production in January 2025 at the Long Wharf Theatre in Connecticut. Longtime friend and Star Wars fan, Matt Barbot. Welcome to Trash Compactor, Matt.
Excited to finally be here.
Yes, I'm glad we could finally work it out. I asked you guys on because I thought, as playwrights, as writers, you might have some interesting thoughts about this question. You know, Star Wars has always been, obviously, a for-profit enterprise, but has something fundamentally shifted since it was sold by George Lucas to the Walt Disney Corporation? You know, is Star Wars just corporate product now, or was it always corporate product?
Yeah, as people who heard my earlier episode will know, my play, The Trade Federation, or Let's Explore Globalization Through the Star Wars Prequels, imagines a world where I am pitching a Star Wars prequel to George Lucas that is called The Trade Federation, a Star Wars story, that kind of fleshes out the political implications of the Trade Federation in Episode 1, and kind of argues that what really needs to happen is that it needs to be even more clear that Episode 1 is a anti-capitalist allegory about how the IMF destroys democracy. And it's a joke, but I also do sort of think, like, I don't know that it's that specific, but I do think there is like an anti-capitalist message in that film. I mean, it's sort of about how these like unaccountable multiplanetary economic organizations pave the way for fascism. I mean, that pretty much just is like the plot of the prequels, you know? I mean, and sure, like there's sort of the implication that the Trade Federation is actually the sock puppet for, you know, the Sith the whole time, yada, yada, yada. But the fact that it's an effective sock puppet, I think, does sort of imply that George Lucas is telling us something about, you know, the nefarious alliance between capitalism and the far right. So, I mean, whether that makes it art or if it just makes it propaganda is maybe another question. But, you know, I think there was certainly something subversive in some of the you know, Lucas-era Star Wars movies. And I also think that there's subversive messages in some of the newer Disney-era stuff, and, you know, particularly in Andor, which I think is, you know, I actually think a lot of Star Wars films probably owe a little bit of debt to the Battle of Algiers, but this one makes it like pretty explicit, you know, which is not to say that all of it is, but it sort of just reminds me of like Marvel Comics, you know, like Marvel Comics is a giant capitalist enterprise, and most of what they put out is shit. But occasionally you get, I don't know, Days of Future Past or something, you know, you get like a really profound meditation on the power of our choices and past left untaken, and, you know, whatever you want to explore. I mean, I think these franchises have learned that, like, giving creative people a certain amount of leeway is profitable, you know, and sometimes that means that people want to say something that's a little bit anti-corporate. But I don't think that's necessarily mutually exclusive with the fact that they are a corporate product. I mean, yes, it's true that, like, part of how capitalism works is that it kind of incorporates and kind of neutralizes movements against itself. But in doing that, it also brings, even if it's a, you know, radically diluted version of that message, it brings that message to a wider audience, which I think you could certainly argue something like Andor does. You know, like, has there ever been a more prison abolitionist Star Wars movie? You know, I thought that was pretty great.
I think what you wind up with the Disney acquisition is you have a lot more, it's less driven by a particular creator, while at the same time it's a lot more visible. I think under Lucas, it was art because it was like a guy who had ideas and a lot of money and no one to tell him no. It was all the product of a very singular vision, and he had the things he wanted to say with it. And I think, like, you see a lot online of, like, you know, keep politics out of Star Wars, and meanwhile George Lucas is naming Trade Federation officials after Republican senators. So, like, there's not like a, you know, and calling Nixon the emperor. So there's not like a lot of, like, it's difficult to make the argument, I think, that under Lucas it wasn't art. I think what you have now is that a lot of the sort of ancillary material is, or ancillary, I always get that word wrong. The other stuff is a lot more visible to people than like the EU was, hit or miss. There was some good stuff in there, and there was some stuff that was weird, and there was some stuff that was half good and half weird. And now I think there's a sense that the problem has been that Star Wars is unfocused now. That Star Wars is like it's just a cash grab. It's like it's nothing but like they're pumping out content. And I think that's really just because the stuff that like I went to go buy at the comic book store every Wednesday is now like in people's face on the Disney Plus homepage. I think like an interesting question that this also raises is like whether like to what extent does like whether it's art or content matter to Disney. And I do think that like it seems to matter a lot to them that people liked Andor a lot more than the Book of Boba Fett. That seems to have like had an impact on them. Beau Willimon was just named. Beau Willimon, who is a great playwright but also wrote for Andor, was just announced to be working on the Rey movie, right? So I do think that these moments of where they realize that, to speak to Andy's point, the risk taking, the sort of allowing for a little bit more leeway on the part of like individual artists to kind of like cook, is like paying off for them in ways that they maybe, I don't think, realized coming off of a string of Marvel successes, which are also dwindling now.
And Beau Willimon also created House of Cards, right?
That's true, yes.
So it's like, I mean, it's not that surprising that somebody who wrote, West Wing for Cynics also wrote like a pretty politically interesting Star Wars thing,
Totally. Well, absolutely. And it's political, but it's also, I mean, I just think it's like, it's very good, and it seems pretty clear to me that Disney was just like Tony Gilroy. I mean, I think an interesting thing about Andor as a project, too, is I think that a lot of people were just like, this, who wants this? Like, nobody needs this show. This is, and there was so much cynicism in the buildup of it. They have this common criticism that I never really understand, which is like, well, we know he's going to die, so what does it matter? And that always kind of excited me as someone who, because I was like, well, this doesn't owe anybody. This show doesn't owe anybody anything, right? Like the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, there were so many expectations because like it had to fit into certain parameters, and it had to be about this character that we knew so much about, and who, whose past had been like so explored already. So it was kind of nice. I was like, it's kind of exciting to just get like a sandbox. I remember watching the first episode and going like, oh, like this is, I was completely unprepared for the kind of show we were settling in for. And it's pretty clear to me that like Disney just kind of was like, do something, like take it and run with it and do something with your group of writers. I think there's something to be said too for the creative process of like letting a bunch of artists work together on something as opposed to like pinning everything to like one guy. But that's one guy in a funny hat. But like we'll see like how that pays off going forward.
I think that's weirdly like a combination of like it's useful to have a pretty high amount of creative control over a pretty small part of the overall thing.
Yeah.
Like that seems to be working for them, at least in some cases. But I think your point too is interesting about the differences and similarities between the things that were being told are TV shows versus like the old extended universe.
Right.
Because like the extended universe, I didn't dive super deep into, but I read some of the books and stuff, and like they really weren't about backstory.
Yeah.
Like they were really just like the further adventures of Obi-Wan Kenobi and Qui-Gon Jinn.
Right.
It wasn't like, why is Qui-Gon Jinn named that? It's like, I don't actually... I think they, for a long time, really overestimated how much people cared about backstory, which is just... I just don't care why Han Solo got that way. I just like how he is,
Yeah, I think... I mean, I think this with any sort of, adaptation of a franchise is kind of, especially when you're coming with a lot of material already, there is always this question of, how to handle established material, how to handle... fan expectation, how to handle, so much of the, especially after because the EU was it was going for decades before the prequels came out, and the prequels didn't really care about it, and so what ended up happening is that there were there was loads of material that was just that was reconciling, and retconning the two, which was kind of an interesting art and an interesting exercise on its own. But I agree. I think there's something to the success of I mean, and I think the first season of Mandalorian does this really well as well, right? You have a particular fixation on a particular thing, and you're telling a very particular story, and you have a lot of control over how that story gets told. In isolation, right? There you don't have. I think this is like the issue. This is an issue with franchises as well, right? Like you have things have to lead into other things and connect in ways. But if you can, as much as you can remain separate from other things, you have a lot of leeway to like just do your thing. This is one of the reasons that like the first season of The Mandalorian is so successful. Why Andor is so successful.
And that's also true with the Marvel movies too. Like with almost every part of the Marvel movies, like the first entry in as like section is always like the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie had a similar thing of like, who are these guys? You know, like people didn't really have expectations about that. And so it was able to be like a cool, quirky, interesting thing. And like same thing with Black Panther. Like people didn't really know that lore. I mean, some people did, but like a lot of people saw that movie having no real idea other than just like, oh, there's a black guy who's a superhero. That's cool, you know? And I feel like even like when they sort of do a soft reset after a big arc, like those are kind of interesting for a little bit before they start getting just like tied up in continuity and stuff. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to solve that, but it sure annoys me. Like it's why I stopped being a like every Wednesday comic book guy. It's like, you know, you would have this great arc that would be built up over years, and then, you know, they would just say, no, never mind, we're doing a different thing. Mm-hmm. And I found that very frustrating. I think I think that's why I'll never be like I'll never be a great nerd. That just pisses me off. And I think you have to think that's cool.
You know, something that both of you hit upon, I think, this idea that if you entrust a small part of the universe to an artist or a group of artists and you say, here, you can go do your thing, then that's sort of a recipe for success. And also this idea that when they're unburdened by the weight of connecting everything and like the next installments, there are all these expectations, like you were saying, like nobody was asking for Andor. Like it wasn't clear that that was the next step in Star Wars storytelling, was to tell that story in that way. If you want to be cynical about it, there's also kind of a sense that by kind of segmenting the audience in this way, they are, you know, making Star Wars for different segments of the viewing public and for different kinds of Star Wars fans. So I think the experience that they had with continuing the franchise as a series of theatrical films, the weight of expectations and the need to have them be super critical and financial successes was kind of a problem, because they learned you can't please everybody, because a lot of people have strong conflicting opinions about what Star Wars is and what it should be and how it should continue. So what they've done is they found a way to segment the audience and make different flavors of Star Wars for different segments of the viewing public and of fandom. I think that, you know, something that you said that was really interesting was like how the expanded universe stuff is just kind of now Star Wars. Like the Acolyte show is an extension of the High Republic, which started out as novels and comics and an expanded universe project. Mm-hmm. And now it's making the leap to live action, which was the real mark of legitimacy is when something appears in live action. So because it is an extension of the High Republic storytelling universe that they've created, it's kind of all of a piece. Like they aren't going to contradict something that was just written in a High Republic novel last year or 2 years ago. It's all a part of the same milieu, if you will. Yeah. So I do think that's really interesting because with the George Lucas films, there was definitely a very clear distinction, no matter how the expanded universe purported to be, you know, the true heir to the Empire, as it were. See what I did there?
I did.
As soon as Lucas shows up again and makes more films, he just does whatever he wants. He doesn't have any regard for the EU. And now, you know, without that clear authorial voice, it's sort of what is more legitimate than the other. I mean, I guess it really depends, like, what makes it to live action.
Yeah. I also think it'd be interesting to see whether they ever make the further leap to making a theatrically released movie that requires you to have watched a TV show to understand it. I feel like that's a further further blurring of those lines, because Star Wars still kind of works in the way that like you can just watch the movies and that's fine, and you're gonna like they maybe they don't stand alone, but they stand together as like the whatever it is now 11 movies, you know.
We may be about to see that with the Mandalorian and Grogu movie that's coming out in either 2025 or 2026. I can't keep track. But it seems like that project is what they're doing instead of season 4 of that show. They're sort of graduating it to feature film status. And I would be surprised if, I mean, obviously, I'm sure that they are going to try to make it as accessible as they can to someone who hasn't seen the show. But if there ever was a project, a feature film Star Wars project, where you may need to rely on knowledge of the show that has come before, it would certainly be that one, I think.
I think it's the culmination of everything, right? Like they're done with the Mandalorian after that, right? It's like the
Right.
but then that's
Yeah.
also part of the Ahsoka show, so it's all just gonna like be Heir to the Empire,
Yeah.
and then like I think it's 2 movies, right? And then it's like I think Filoni's doing one, and the other guy,
Jon Favreau.
Jon
Yeah.
Favreau, yeah,
Yeah, I think Favreau is doing the Mandalorian and Grogu film.
yeah,
And then Filoni is doing a film that's the culmination of all of the arcs from
right,
like
right.
that like New Republic, Heir to the Empire thing that they're doing with Mando and with Ahsoka.
Yeah,
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how that develops because one of you said, I think, the lines are really blurred there. Film franchises are behaving more like the interconnected universes of an ongoing TV show, and TV is becoming more event-like, shorter runs. How this relates specifically to the question of is Star Wars art or content, I would say it's kind of like reflecting the changing landscape of the industry.
I never really got that. I don't watch a lot of TV. I mean, I don't watch a whole lot of movies either, but I'm definitely more of a movie person than a TV person. And I never really got the assumption that, like, a TV show is like a more casual, low stakes endeavor, but it takes 12 hours to watch it, Whereas, like, a movie is a big deal, but you can watch it in an evening, I don't understand. Like, so, like, the idea that I'm going to watch a TV show, like, let's assume that I care about the overall story of the franchise. The idea that, like, I'm going to watch a TV show where nothing really happens, like, nothing that important to the overall story happens, but I'm going to spend 6 times the amount of time watching that as I will watching a movie that, resets everything and ties up loose ends and, establishes interesting new characters. I just don't understand why I would do that. Like, that just seems like a weird way to spend my time. I really value the economy of a movie, and in a play too. I mean, I'm a playwright, so I like the idea of like 2 hours and everything changes, rather than 12 hours and everything stays the same. That doesn't appeal to me.
I suppose the answer would be, there's this line that TV is about characters and movies are about plot. TV is also about plot and movies are also about characters. But that because of the amount of time that you have to play with, it provides an opportunity to get more deeply involved with the characters over a longer period of time. You sort of develop a relationship with them. Yeah, I mean, it's just a different kind of storytelling. It's a different kind of engagement. I think it also has to do with that ongoing conversation, like the meta commentary that you have week to week discussing the show and like thinking about the show. So you have kind of a different relationship with it. Watching Andor, I don't know if you guys watched it in real time, but the experience of watching that show week to week, waiting for the next episode.
Having Twitter.
Yeah. Like at the end of every episode of that, like I was just like, I have to talk about this.
I remember like what an enormous impact Nemec's speech, like his pitch to Cassian.
Nemec's manifesto, yeah.
Well, but even before you actually hear his manifesto, when he's talking about just ideas with Cassian over whatever their gross breakfast is that they both hate, they don't tell you what they're eating. That's disgusting. And I think isn't it the milk from the weird goats? Anyway, they're talking about it, and he has that line about like hiding behind 40 atrocities, is easier than like facing up to one, and that's how the Empire works. And I remember just like how impactful that was for like the week in between, like how much people were like, this is like, I can't believe I'm watching this in a Star Wars
Like actually a profound insight about how evil functions. Yeah.
Right, and just like this whole, and then his manifesto was we finally hear like bits of it in the season finale, and that similarly had a lot of people doing fan edits over it and like things like that. But like it speaks, I think, a lot to the power of that sort of consumption model and the danger of treating stuff that isn't just content as content. Like I remember I feel like I was working in media back when like the word content was something that people that started to creep in, and back then it meant the stuff that was populating the site, right? Like we talked about it meant like content for the site, but it wasn't like a genre of thing, right? There were no content creators. You were an article was content because it had to go up. It was there. It was how do you and so the idea of content came up around site architecture, around just making sure that you were like getting your daily number of hits because it meant that you had to have stuff up. But that idea then of like we just need stuff there, I think has like had a really deleterious effect on like the streaming model, right? Where you have shows, we need to populate it with stuff. And so there's a lot of stuff getting made. And it's all being treated the same. Just uploading everything all at once is again not really. It doesn't do justice to the material all the time. Like the idea is like we need more stuff, and it has to be there. And it doesn't matter whether people watch it, and it doesn't matter whether it has an impact or it enters the conversation. It's just there. I feel like that's often my experience with opening a streaming app is just like there's a lot of stuff. I just don't know what any of it is.
Yeah. And going back to your original question, Josh, like that dynamic that Matt just identified is like, I think, a deeply anti-art way of thinking about making anything, Like that is absolutely a sort of capitalist model of production rather than of like generating something based on, it being, you're being inspired to create something or it being something that you feel like is a message you want to send out into the universe or something, or a question you want to explore. Any of the things that make artists do what they do is not served well by this model of like, if we don't have a new Star Wars every year, people are going to forget about Star Wars, which I just don't think is true. And like, certainly isn't how like filmmaking, TV making works everywhere. I mean, in Britain, they'll have, 5 episodes of a show and then go away for 3 years and then come back with another 5 episodes. And people are like, oh, Sherlock, I remember that. Like if it's good, people are going to remember it. You don't have to constantly be, feeding them new stuff like it's an assembly line, which doesn't mean that nothing good can happen in that model, but does mean I think there's like a profound pressure against things that are particular and unique and that are thoughtful. I think that pressure mitigates against that.
Well, and certainly when that stuff gets made, certainly there's no incentive to make stuff that's good and thoughtful and quality because it's all gonna be no one's gonna watch it. I think when people talk about the sort of like Marvel situation, right? People talk about how all these movies still get made, right? People still make mid-budget movies. People still make rom-coms. People still make, and sometimes it's sort of true, but like really what ends up happening is they wind up getting dumped on a platform where no one watches them. They don't get these theatrical releases where they stick around for a little while. Word of mouth builds up. They sort of get buried. I still stumble across a movie that's got like a star-studded cast that I've never heard of before because it was like launched in like 2018 on like a content-heavy weekend, and probably just wasn't that good. But even like a movie that wasn't that good that had, that used to be the point of having movie stars, right? But like I think the question of art versus content is further complicated by the fact that so much stuff, no matter whether it can be considered to have artistic integrity, gets treated like content, gets treated like mere content, like just it all sort of goes into the same slop pile.
Yeah, that's a very good point. The dynamic that you just laid out about how there just needs to be stuff up there is why, I personally have so much consternation about AI-generated content. It's not that I think AI-generated content will surpass human creativity, but because, as you say, like there just has to be something there. People don't necessarily watch it or engage with it in a deep way. The AI-generated stuff would serve that function just as well. And that's what I find so yucky and gross, for lack of a better term. The answer to my questions for me is Andor. Is it possible to make art under these circumstances? I would say yes, you can make Andor. They made Andor.
I like how that's really like mostly what we're talking about is just, hey guys, remember how good Andor was? Remember how much we all liked Andor?
Yeah. Well, so the other thing about Andor, Matt, the other thing that you made me think of was like, yeah, a lot of this stuff just gets lost. So is it kind of necessary to be part of a franchise to not get lost in the shuffle? And then I was wondering, like, could you make Andor a non-Star Wars thing good?
Yeah, I think part of what makes Andor impactful is that it is Star Wars. I mean, like, I think you could make a good.
Right.
I think you could make, and there are like good stories like that are sci-fi and that are anti corporate and anti like colonial and all those But I think part of what makes Andor impactful is its place within this world that we recognize and this world that we sort of like know the rules for and what it sort of does with that. I mean, another example I'd give and then get called a cuck for it or whatever is Last Jedi, which I think is like a movie that I think people use the word subversive about it, and because it's like a rule of certain guys on the internet that they stop watching a movie halfway through. But like it's not. It doesn't. Part of what makes like The Last Jedi what it is that it has this kind of like reflexive tone about the rest of the franchise, and it is very much a movie about like the value of Star Wars. It's about like, is this still useful to us? And it and the answer is yes. The answer is like, yes, we need these stories. Yes, we do respond well to them. Yes, they have like a role to play in
the culture.
Yeah, and in the development of our like imagination of like what is possible for us, right? So I think that's another example of a story that sort of like sits within. I think to the point of like letting people have like a lot of control over like a little bit of the universe. Like, I'm a huge fan of like the weird tone of like the Dr. Aphra comics. I think those are really fun. And within that, it's like it's a story with a lot of queer characters and a lot of diversity. And I think that the artists involved with that are allowed to do that because it is like a comic that comes out ever so often, like amidst a bunch of other comics. So I don't think like Dr. Aphra and her like polycule are going to make it onto Disney Plus.
Here's hoping.
But I do think those comics are a lot of fun. I think they're funny. They're kind of irreverent. They do like interesting like things. They play with genre a lot. And that's, again, I think because of the value of, like, letting writers, like, play around in a way that doesn't, like, have a huge impact on the rest of the franchise.
I'm going to disagree with you a little bit, Matt, here, just on a small point, which is, like, I actually think, like, Last Jedi and Andor work in really different ways in relationship to the rest of the franchise. I think you're totally right that, like, Last Jedi is very meta, very self-reflexive, but it also, like, I mean, it's got Luke Skywalker in it. Like, Luke Skywalker's a main character.
Yeah.
Like, it is real Star Warsy, and it's about like the Force and all of that. Whereas like Andor, I mean, you could reskin Andor and make it a non-Star Wars thing. Like, I think really easily. Like, there's no Jedis. There's like not really any Force stuff. There's no characters that are important characters other than in Rogue One, which we haven't really talked about, but is also I think an exceptionally good movie. And there's also no alien monsters. Whereas, like, for me, like, one of the great pleasures of Mandalorian is, like, wow, look at those cool puppets. But you don't even get that in Andor. Like, Andor could be a standalone thing, I think, actually, very easily. I mean, it wouldn't get made. But I think that's sort of the thing. Is, like, if you have this interesting sci-fi universe that you want to create, like, well, can it be a Star Wars thing? Well, then you maybe get it made. And if it can't be a Star Wars thing, you probably don't. But I kind of feel like that just seems like...
Well, unless you're Zack Snyder.
Right, but that just seemed like it was sort of riding on the...
No, I agree with you that you could reskin it. And like I said, I think there are probably similar stories out there. But I do think part of what makes Andor impactful is that like we are coming to it with a lot of context already. And so like it sits with us a little bit differently, and it sort of it has a shorthand to like sort of situate us in a context in a particular way. Like I love when Saw Gerrera is listing all the leftist groups he doesn't like. A lot of those are like words that we know, you know what I mean? And they have meaning because we've seen all the
But I also feel like a lot of what made Andor successful is how it didn't fulfill the expectations people brought to it. What you said of like, I can't believe I'm hearing this in a Star Wars thing. Like that's a pleasure that we only get from that because of how much it doesn't feel like Star Wars. You know what I mean?
Right, which we wouldn't have if it was a completely original thing because it wouldn't strike
Nobody
us in
would
that way,
say,
guess
"I
is
can't
my
believe
point.
we're hearing this in the Amazon Plus adaptation of the word for world is forest."
Yeah, exactly. I can absolutely believe I'm hearing this in an Andy Boyd play.
You're so sweet.
This is exactly what I come to see Andy Boyd
Yeah,
plays
yeah.
for, actually.
Our Hilaire Sean once described me as the ghost of a 1930s hobo, and I was like, that's mean, but it's fair. You know, there's a
Yeah.
brand.
Just to kind of close out here, for me, the ultimate distinction of Star Wars as content versus Star Wars as art, if you want to use that word, it was the mostly singular expression of a single artist that had a point of view that was unfiltered as much as possible versus, now the decisions about what Star Wars is and where it's going are made by Disney, and their aim is to have Star Wars going as long as possible in perpetuity. There will be new Star Wars content long after we are gone from this earth. It's sort of like this, self-perpetuating enterprise, for lack of a better word. And so there's that. But I think, as we've identified in this conversation, within that, these like smaller fiefdoms, some real worthy stuff is able to be made. So, is Star Wars content in a way that it didn't used to be? I mean, I suppose in some sense, but, anything that generates a show like Andor, and even for my money and for yours, The Last Jedi, I think is worth some serious consideration and not just writing off. Do you guys have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I just think, I think, I don't know, I think that, like, central to the question of whether it's art or content is also, like, there has to be a hunger on Disney's part to continue to, like, explore new territory and continue to surpass. And I think without that, then it just becomes, like, how do we fill this trough? And that's boring, and that hurts things in the long run in a way that, like, finding artists that they're interested in working with and figuring out what those artists might be interested in doing isn't, and has actually paid off for them. I'm excited for the Acolyte.
Yeah, me too.
I think Leslie Headland's a great writer, and I hear she's a legit Star Wars fan from some other friends of mine who knew her before.
I think that really the central tension here is that what people actually want is to be surprised and delighted by things. And capitalism requires surprise and novelty and newness, things that are genuinely new. But capitalists don't know how to do that. The people who, the suits at Disney, don't know how to make something that nobody's seen before. They just know how to make something that people liked the first time. They know how to say, Obi-Wan, people like him, let's do a thing with him again, and that's not interesting. So it's there's this weird push and pull where, I think capitalists need artists, but they also don't trust artists because artists, but by that very function of being able to make something new and interesting, might make something that is new and interesting and not profitable, or new and interesting in a way that upsets the other priorities of the franchise or something. The desire to have creativity but also to have it be tightly controlled is just an inherently unstable dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, there's that too. And then the other thing, I would argue that there were some fans who don't want to be surprised and delighted.
Yeah, that's true. That's
true. I mean, I think I would say that there's probably stuff that, I mean, I think that a lot of it's politically motivated, or it's just not politically motivated, but it's motivated
racism,
by
sexism.
It's like a worldview. It's like
it's a worldview thing. I mean, and so I think that there's some times where I think they would be surprised and delighted by certain things. I think every time there's a hallway scene, they're surprised and delighted to see. I know, and I think I was delighted by it too in Rogue One. That you see Darth Vader and he's whooping ass in a hallway, and that was cool and interesting, and I thought genuinely kind of scary in the moment. But that's not the only thing that I have left to be delighted by in my life. Right. And it's I think there's different cultural. I think there's different corporate cultures, right? Apple. So
I'm so excited for the Greta Gerwig Rogue movie.
Yeah. That would be a lot of. But if they let Greta Gerwig make that movie, that would be a lot of fun. I think Ryan Coogler did a great job. within the constraints of what he does, you know. But at the same time, I'm super happy to see Ryan Coogler like set free again. He's making an antebellum vampire film, which sounds delightful.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Well, so what's interesting, though, is that they tried to do something similar with Star Wars. And I think The Last Jedi is sort of the last vestige of that approach, where they got, Rian Johnson, like a filmmaker with a point of view, Gareth Edwards for Rogue One. They had a similar sort of a model where they went to young filmmakers that, had something to say, had something to bring, and then they sort of pulled back from that. One of the things that I would love to see someday or hear more about is the Lord and Miller version of Solo that freaked them out so much that they had to get rid of them and hire Ron Howard to make the movie that they thought they were.
By the way, I think Solo's an okay movie, but I also think
I do too.
I also think Ron Howard is such an obvious choice for the franchise. I'd like to see him get his own movie that he gets to do top to bottom. But I think that I agree, and I do sort of see them. I think with Leslie Headland and Tony Gilroy and now Beau Willimon on the other movie, there seems to be some interest in exploring that more. And I think that the critical response to Andor, I think, probably reassured them on that path a little bit.
Yeah, I hope so. I'd be really curious the viewing figures for the various streaming shows because there's on the one hand critical acclaim, which I'm sure that they obviously consider, but then there's also okay, how many people actually watched it versus how many people actually watched this. And it is interesting because the shows, I think, allow them a little more leeway in terms of being risky or doing interesting things because they don't have to hit those opening weekend box office numbers. The streaming platforms are like a black box where you don't know exactly what the metrics of success are. And comparatively, I think, even though they are on par with the cost of a feature film, I think they're slightly less expensive, and you get to have, multiple flavors of Star Wars in a year. So you can please these people with this one and these people with that one. The High Republic era is not something that I've explored much. I'm very intrigued, but it's also clear to me that they are making The Acolyte with certain fans in mind. It's not necessarily the same set that, say, Andor or the Book of Boba Fett had in mind. That could just be projection on my part. It's a lot of supposition. But that said, I'm really, really excited about The Acolyte because I want to see what else Star Wars can do.
I thought having Grogu fight the woke mind virus was a mistake, but I think the general move to kind of appeal to everybody with different content is probably a good one.
Yeah, that woke mind virus. Oh, goodness.
That just seemed a little on the nose.
Yeah, you're right. Do you guys have anything you want to plug or you want to mention before we close out?
Not that you haven't already mentioned.
Get the Trade Federation, get Occupy Prescott. They're also on my new Play Exchange page if you have that and don't want to pay $8.
Where can people find you if you have social media that you wouldn't mind sharing? And if you do, that's totally fine because who knows what kind of riffraff this Star Wars podcast attracts, and who needs that in their life?
Yeah, I don't. All my stuff is private now. I don't use them, and I don't really post much anymore.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah. It's been kind of liberating.
I'm on Instagram and Andy J. Boyd. You can follow me on there.
I will add the relevant links in the show notes. I want to thank my guests, Andy and Matt, for engaging in this conversation with me. If you like what you heard, please follow TrashCom Pod on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. And transcripts of this episode and all our other episodes can be found at trashcompod.com. And we will see you on the next one.